Hey iMovie users, welcome to another Kurt Papke tutorial. Today we're going to talk about multi-camera production, both on the production side and using iMovie to do the final edit. So what I'm going to go over today is how to use two iPhones to get two different camera angles. In this case I have one set up on my left and one set up on my right. And what we're going to look at first of all is how to stage it, and then how to use iMovie to splice the two together, including a soundtrack. I actually have three inputs here. I have the two iPhones, and I have my Shure microphone here that we're going to use the audio track from. The reason we're including the separate audio track today is there's really two different kinds of multi-camera recording scenarios. There's one, and this is the typical case, where, for instance, you're recording a musical performance, it's a concert or something like that. Like this particular situation where I was in Aravaipa Canyon playing my Native American flute, and I recorded that with the same two iPhones and my Zoom audio recorder. This was the third channel, the common soundtrack. And in those particular cases, the important thing is the continuity of the soundtrack. You can't have any gaps in the sound. You can't be cutting or splicing or breaking the sound at any particular time. It has to be completely continuous. The other situation is like this one right here, where we have two cameras, but it's just a talking head. This might be an interview, it might be an intro or an outro to your YouTube video, and you have control over time. You can stop time, and then you can restart time, and it's no big deal because your brain isn't requiring a continuity of the soundtrack, and that's a much simpler situation. So we'll cover both in this video. The second situation is a little bit easier, gives you a little bit more creative freedom. In both cases, this is pretty straightforward with iMovie. I'm only using two cameras today. I've used up to three cameras to do this in the talking head situation, and that starts to stress iMovie a little bit. As you know, iMovie has one main track and then one overlay, and that's it. So anyway, here we go.
Okay, let's have a look at the camera setup. We're going to put a close-up camera on one side. I use an old iPhone 5. I don't even have a cell plan on it anymore. It's wireless only, but it's useful for filming. And on the other side, I have my main camera, which is an iPhone 10 on a floor tripod to give me a little bit more height. I use Filmic Pro for filming. And it's important to set and lock the white balance on both cameras so that they match reasonably well. Then lock the exposure and lock the focus so that as you move in and out of the frame, nothing is changing on you.
Okay, the last thing to set up before you start recording is your audio. It's important to use one central microphone rather than one of the two microphones that are on your cameras or your iPhones, because your phones are going to be different distances. As you turn your head, you're going to get a different intensity or a different audio level. So when you're shooting multiple microphones, it's very important to use one stationary mic. I like to use a lavalier mic because it moves with me, and I'm quite often a long distance away from my camera. And I feed the lavalier mic into a Zoom H1 recorder, and this whole setup with the giant squid lavalier mic and the H1N recorder is about $150 all told, which is very reasonable for very good quality audio. The boom mics are very nice and everything, the shotgun mics. They have wonderful sound, but it's very difficult to do that with one person. And the lavalier mic works great for me, especially since I do a lot of recording out in the backcountry where I'm a long distance away from my camera. So that's the key is one microphone hopefully, or preferably something that moves with you as you're looking between the two microphones or moving around your kitchen or doing whatever you're doing when you're doing the recording.
After you've pressed start and you're recording on all of your cameras that you're using, and you've pressed start on your audio recording, clap 3 times. This will provide a visual and very audible sync marker that is very easy to find on your timeline on the audio track, and you can use this to line up all your various sources. This is critical. If you don't do this, it's a pain in the butt to line everything up. So don't forget to clap 3 times to leave yourself a sync marker. Okay, let's start our editing. We're going to look at 2 different methods of doing our editing in iMovie. In the first method, we're going to use overlays and sync to audio. So our strategy is to align or sync the camera clips and the audio, all 3 of them together, and then we'll cut out the overlay to let the main camera show through. There's pros and cons to both of these approaches. In this approach, the positives are it's fast and easy, it works well for music, as we were discussing before, and it's easy to do picture-in-picture or split screens instead of just switching between the cameras. The downsides are it's limited to only 2 cameras. It limits your use of overlays to the area where you're employing the second camera, and it can be kind of clumsy to cut sections out or do trimming because you have to cut both the audio track and then the video tracks that lay on top of it. So it's a little bit more error prone in that regard. All right, let's get started. Okay, so we have our 3 clips, our left camera, our right camera or main camera, and our audio track all imported into iMovie, ready to go. And I went ahead and took the liberty of syncing all 3 of them up in the timeline, so these are all nicely lined up. I've already muted the top layer here. Now I'll go ahead and mute the second layer as well. You don't want, the only audio you want enabled is your main one. Otherwise, it's going to really be very confusing because you have all these different sounds playing at the same time. The other thing we're going to do, we're going to make one quick adjustment. iMovie defaults to this top track, the overlay, as a cutaway, and we're going to change that to a picture-in-picture. The reasoning behind that is when you're making your cuts, you want to be able to see both of the tracks at the same time. I just find it very helpful to be able to see both of the tracks when I'm figuring out where I want to make the camera transitions. So the next thing we're going to do is go in and find our transition points. We can just scrub through here looking for them. So here's our first one right here. And I like to use markers for these to go ahead and set them up and figure out where I want the transitions to be, and then I do all the cuts in a row without going back and forth. I find it to be less confusing if I set them up first and do the cuts rather than find a spot, do a cut, find a spot, do the cut, etc. I prefer to see what I'm doing before I actually make the changes to the clips. So I think I've got one more in here towards the end, right about here. Okay, that's it. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4 clips where I'm going to use the secondary camera. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut out these areas where I'm not going to use that top camera and let the bottom clip show through. So I'm going to do that by selecting a range. You can see iMovie even tells you what to do. Press the R key while dragging to select a range. So I'm going to press the R key. The icon is going to change to the little range selector there. I'm going to select this range, and then I'm just going to hit the delete key, and it goes away. And now I have these nice markers in here telling me where these ranges are, so I can go ahead and select the next range, cut that out, select the next range, cut that out, select the next range that I want to cut that out, move over a little here, R key, select the range, cut it out. Okay, now let's go ahead and make sure we have what we want here. That one looks pretty good. Maybe I want to move it just a little bit to the left. Now I can still do that just by selecting the edge and dragging. I can move that over a little bit and make sure I have that exactly where I want it.
Breaking the sound at any
okay, that one looks pretty good. This one looks pretty good. Okay, I think my cuts are all set to go. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of the clips where I have the overlays there, all 4 of them, and I'm going to change them to a cutaway. Okay. I also like to put in a little bit of a fade. I find 1/4 of a second works pretty well for me. 0.25 seconds. Click. And now I have a nice soft edge transition between my cameras. And I find a 1/4 of a second works pretty well. It's not so short that it's not detectable, but yet it's short enough that you don't get this long fade effect. But you can play with the time to figure out exactly how long you like to see the way it works. Okay, if we need to go back in and make a cut somewhere in the middle here, let's say I have a problem in my audio track, I have an or an ah or something like that, I can't use the range to do that because I need to select both my bass track and the audio track, so I can select them both. You can see they're both highlighted in gold here. And now I'm going to break the track at that point, select my other cut point, and now I'm going to do an option slash, and that trims the clip to the playhead from the nearest edge. And now I've got my little cut there, and my audio and my video is still in sync because I cut both the audio track and the video track the same amount. So everything is still good. So that's basically how you do it. Now I can still drag my titles down. I can do whatever I want to do. I can use these areas where I'm not using the second camera and put in overlays if I wish. But that's how we do it. All right, we're finished with method 1. Now let's take a look at the second method. And I call this export merged. In this method, our strategy is to export or share each camera merged with the main audio, and then we will cut them individually into the timeline. The pros of this approach is there's no limit to the number of cameras. So if you want to use 3 or 4 cameras, this is the way you got to do it. It works very well for the talking heads because you'll have easy cuts and it frees up an overlay layer. The downside of this is there's a little extra prep time with the merging, and it can be a little error prone if you are going to be using this with a music situation to maintain the continuity of the audio. So you can do it, but you have to be very, very careful not to create any gaps. All right, let's get started. Okay, we're ready to start our process with method 2. And our starting point is identical to method 1, except in this case I've already taken care of muting the second audio track. And our first step in the process is to export or share each of these tracks individually combined with the bottom audio track. So right now, because my top track constantly covers the bottom track, there's no gaps in it, I can just go ahead and do a share to a file, and I'm just simply going to go 1080p, quality high, better quality, and I'm going to simply go to my desktop, working copy top, and I'm going to save that. So while that's processing, I don't have to wait for that to finish. I can actually keep working, and iMovie will keep everything straight. So now what I want to do is I want to erase the top layer here and then do the same thing. Do another share to a file. And next. And I'm going to send this to the desktop, working copy bottom. All right, this will take a couple minutes to complete, and we'll come back when it's all done. Our exports or shares have completed, and now we're ready to go. So now I have a blank iMovie project here, a brand new, fresh iMovie project. Let me just move my window aside here, and you can see the two completed files are on my desktop. So let's drag them in. First our bottom track, and then our top track. All right. Now let's go ahead and put our top track on top, which makes sense. Let me zoom in a bit so we can see what we're doing. Okay, now we can see both tracks have their soundtrack in them. And now I'm going to go begin doing my cuts. Let's find our first spot. Let's make our first cut right here. And what we're going to do, the cuts get done a little bit differently. Let me go ahead and put a marker on the start and a marker on the finish. And so the next step in the process is to get rid of the junk to the left-hand side here. So let's do a command break and break that off right there, and then we can delete that. And then we'll break the bottom track at the same spot. Now, I almost forgot to mention there's one very important step here, is you have to have snapping on in order for the cursor to be exactly on the cut points between the two tracks. So make sure you have snapping turned on to do this correctly. So we have it on here. We had it off before. We had it on before. It's on the View menu. Turn snapping on. Okay, so now you can see as I drag my cursor, when I hit the cut point, it's going to stick no matter where I am, even if I'm looking at the bottom track. So let's go to the bottom track, and we will cut that at the same point. Then we will cut our top. We can actually cut both tracks at the same time. Here's a little clue for you, a little time saver. If you select both tracks, you can just do a Command B, and they will both cut at the same spot. Now what we want to do is move the top track down onto the base of the timeline, and unfortunately it's still attached here. So let's just kind of move it out of the way for a second, and then we go ahead and delete our bottom track, and then we can just slide our track right in there, and there we go. So now if I play it back, we have a seamless transition from one to the next, and we are not using the overlay track anymore. So now if we wanted to keep on going, we can find our next spot where we make a transition and do exactly the same thing. So it's right about here. We're transitioning to the left camera, and that lasts until just about this spot. We'll mark that. So let's go ahead and get rid of, well, we'll do our cuts here on both tracks at the same time. So make sure you have both the upper and the lower track selected, and then we'll do a Command B, and then we want to get rid of this piece to the left, and then make sure we have both tracks selected at our cut point. Do a Command B, and there we go. Then we can actually, rather than just moving it over to the side, we can move it to where we want it, and then get rid of the unwanted track. And there we go. So now we have two cuts in place. So I can just continue along doing this as much as I want. One of the big differences between this method, between method 2 and method 1, is I can now adjust these cut points if I want to. If this is a musical performance, you can't touch anything, because right now, even though there's a break here between these two clips, the audio will be continuous. Okay, iMovie will stitch these together when you share to Facebook or YouTube or wherever you're going to, and this will appear completely seamless. But if we're in a blank in a dialogue spot where there was nothing happening, we can go in and adjust this and move either of these cut points to the left or the right and not have any issues. You can see we've got nothing left on our overlay layer with this method, so we can put a second layer on top, or if we wanted to, we could put a third camera, bring in a third camera and place that on top after we've done the first two. So this particular technique works for as many cameras as you want. So there you go. There's method 2 for doing multiple camera editing in iMovie, and in this case, it gives us a nice clean timeline when we're all done.
Just one more tip before I leave you today. This particular outro is being recorded with just one camera, but you can add variety to your shots even with one camera if you record in 4K and then use the Ken Burns or the clipping to zoom in or out of the scene. You don't want to do it with huge jumps, but small amounts can add visual interest and help contrast different points that your speaker is making without using two cameras. So you don't always have to use two cameras to add interest. You can sometimes do it with one if you do it carefully. So anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you learned something in this video and that you're going to go out and make your first multicam video using your iPhones and iMovie. So if you found this video helpful, please click like or subscribe below. And leave me a comment. I love getting comments, feedback from people, what they liked or didn't like about my videos or ideas for future videos. And we'll see you next time around. Thanks a lot.